Good. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and welcome to Glucksman Ireland House at NYU. My name is Caroline Hafey. I'm the assistant director here, and I'll ask at this time if you don't mind just silencing any cell phones or electronic devices. That would be great. We're going to have a conversation here tonight to talk about the brilliant Jaunita Casey and the new edition of The Horse of Selene from Tramp Press, and with our contributing editor, Mary Burke. So we'll have a conversation for about 30 minutes or so with some readings as well from the book, and then we will open it up to a Q&A. We're also selling copies of the book downstairs, so I hope that you'll all join us for a glass of wine and potentially to pick up a copy as well. So I'll just begin by saying a little bit about Tramp Press in general. So Tramp was launched by Lisa Cohen and Sarah Davis Goff in 2014 to find, nurture, and publish exceptional literary talent. Tramp is based in Ireland and publishes internationally. Their authors include Dora Negrifa, Mona El-Tahawy, Sarah Baum, Mike McCormick, Sophie White, and Jade Sharma, to name a few. Tramp Press authors have won Irish Book Awards, the International Dublin Literary Award, the Goldsmiths Prize, the Rooney Prize, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, the Hennessy New Irish Writing Award, the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize, among many, and they've been nominated and shortlisted for many more, including the Booker Prize, the Costa, the Desmond Elliott Prize, and the Guardian First Book Award, among others. This is to say, Tramp Press knows good writing. In addition to publishing new authors, Tramp Press has the Recovered Voices series. So this series demonstrates their commitment to rescuing and recovering forgotten literature and to re-engaging with those writers whose work is still valuable, still relevant, and still brilliant. The Recovered Voices series is Tramp's way of bringing overlooked voices back into the contemporary conversation with the hope of enriching and deepening our modern lives. So Jaunita Casey's The Horse of Selene is the newest addition to the Recovered Voices series, and we're so excited to launch it here in New York tonight with Dr. Mary Burke. And so, Jaunita Casey, just a little bit of background information about her. She was a best-selling novelist, celebrated poet, horse trainer, and artist. She was born to an Irish traveler mother and English Romany father, and raised by English adoptive parents with ties to the circus industry. Casey identified with the many heritages she considered her own. She resided with Romanies in England for a time, worked as a circus horsemaster, and lived a bohemian life in Ireland with her Irish husband in the 1960s and 70s, during which time she wrote the masterpiece, The Horse of Selene, which was originally published in 1971, is that right?
71, yeah.
So 1971, and back again. And Dr. Mary Burke is professor of English and Irish literature concentration coordinator at the University of Connecticut at Storrs. Her work has placed with NPR, the Irish Times, RTE, and Faber. Mary Burke is a former University of Notre Dame Irish Institute NEH Fellow, MLA Irish Literature Committee Chair, and a 2022 Trinity College Dublin LHR Fellow. Her research focuses on race in Irish America, Irish and Irish American minorities and identities, Irish modern drama and prose, the works of James Joyce, Irish fashion history, and modern and contemporary Irish women's writing. Her first book, Synge and the Cultural History of the Irish Traveller, was published by Oxford University Press in 2009. Her latest book, Race, Politics, and Irish America, A Gothic History, was just published by Oxford this past March, so I encourage you to pick up a copy of that as well. Mary will be in conversation tonight with Dr. Kelly Sullivan of Ireland House and myself this evening. And with that, I think we can get the conversation started. Does that sound good? Wonderful.
Thank you, Caroline. Caroline is the reason this book is back in the conversation, actually. I went to an event, what year was it, 2018?
Yes, 2018.
Because Caroline herself has done some Dorothy McCardle reissues with the same Recovered Voices series with Tramp Press. And I spoke to Sarah from Tramp Press that evening, and she said to me, you know, if you had to name a woman author who's really neglected, who would that be, you know? And we just started talking, and I said, Jaunita Casey. She said, who's Jaunita Casey? And that was, you know, the beginning of how this book sort of came back in the conversation. So thank you.
Thank you.
Not just for this evening, but for that long ago event, that has facilitated all of this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Juanita. Kelly knows a lot more about art and horses than I do. So Kelly's going to pick up the conversation at times as well. And please just sort of, shut me up, at times as well, and to sort of interject. But I suppose I should start with, Juanita is a person who she lived under 5 separate names. She had 5 identities. She had multiple expertises. She lived this hybrid life in terms of nationality, in terms of what she did for a living, in terms of the kinds of worlds she moved in. So I guess I should explain who she is first of all. Let me just see what's up here first. So this is, I'll just slowly go through the pictures. I guess we'll start with this one. That's the original edition. The first thing to note is that this is Juanita's own cover ink drawing. I'm hoping Kelly will explain. She has all the sort of terminology for exactly what kinds of horses these are. There are particular horses that repeat over and over again in Juanita's drawings. So the 1971 edition had her own drawings. I corresponded with Juanita for my first book. She passed in 2012, and I was corresponding with her about 2007, 2008. And she would include little ink drawings of horses in her letters to me. So they are prized possessions of mine. This is her in the 70s in Ireland. She lived there from 63 to about 72-ish. So I'll get to that. But I should start at the start and explain how it is that she had all these identities. So she was born in 1925. She was adopted. The name her adoptive family gave her, I've had to keep notes of all of this, Joy Barlow. She discovered absolutely years later that her birth mother had given her the name Lorna Newman. She, in terms of her adoptive parents kind of recede into the background in terms of how she sort of imagines and thinks about her own origins, because she really talks about her Uncle Walter all the time. Uncle Walter was a farmer, well-to-do farmer. Like Juanita, he's somebody who sort of was able to move between different kinds of worlds. You probably imagine that he has, horses and cows and so on. If I say he's a farmer, he also had circus animals. He had a circus that would overwinter on his farm. And one of Juanita's earliest memories is of python's eggs being kept warm in the oven of the farmhouse kitchen. So this was her first contact with animals. She was, also he would, through Walter, she had a first contact with Ireland. He would take boat trips to Waterford. For horse purchase kind of research and so on, and he would take her with him as a kid. So she first, landed on the south coast of Ireland with her uncle as a child. He's very formative, because he told her her whole childhood that she was the offspring of a short-lived relationship between an Irish traveller mother and a British Romany father. I've since been talking to Sheba, her daughter from her third marriage to an Irishman, Sheba Tobias now. And Sheba has been slowly unraveling the research. She found her mother's birth cert, and Sheba's take on it now, and it's one that Juanita came to late in life as well, is that she probably was the biological daughter of a British Romany woman, but this may not be a surprise if you know how things operate in the past. Probably Walter was her biological father, because he had a lot of contact with Romanis through his horse trading. So he could speak fluent Romany, the language of the British Romanis. Juanita picked it up as a child as well. So one of the pictures we'll see as we go on is Juanita on the set of these are some of the horse paintings, and I'm hoping Kelly will talk about, we can backtrack to these again when Kelly's speaking maybe, but there's one of her here in 1961. This is maybe the next one on, this is her in the 50s. Actually, maybe I'll just attempt to go chronologically with Juanita. So she's with Walter, they hit Ireland, then she starts working with horses as a teen. She gets expelled from school. She's very, very wild. She comes from a well-to-do family who sent her to a nice private school, but she doesn't last there long. She's a very learned person, a very cultured person, but she's kind of largely self-taught because she leaves school early. In her teens, she works again for a well-to-do farmer in the Dorset area. His name is Fisher. He's older than she is. She runs off with him. She gets him to sell the farm. And they buy a boat. They moor the boat in Cornwall. And again, I'm hoping you'll be able to speak to this. There's a massive art scene in Cornwall at the time. This would be in the 1940s. And so she becomes part of kind of she's on the edges of that art scene. She's an exhibited artist. This is a very, very important thing to remember, because one of the ways in which she's been forgotten is that I think of her as an Irish writer and a British artist. She was exhibited in the 40s. She, people bought her paintings. She was known quantity. She marries a man called Sven Berlin. So she leaves Mr. Fisher behind. Mr. Fisher had taken her, by the way. He's only a tiny sort of moment in her biography, but he had his importance from my point of view is that he took her to Kinsale as well. So it actually, and another important note for in terms of the novel is that she's a teen bride in Kinsale, right, late teens at this point. 1940s, she encounters a young farmer son called Miceal, and who's blue-eyed, handsome, very repressed, and he takes her jaunting throughout Kinsale, and he's crazy about her and falls madly in love with her. Sheba tells me this, and I think it's in Azerbaijan as well, this detail, right? And Sheba's very convinced that this is the origin of Miceal, the repressed young farmer who falls in love with the bohemian Selene in the novel. So that's the first husband is Mr. Fisher. The second one then is Sven Berlin. By the 1950s, they're married. They pull up to the New Forest, which is an unenclosed tract of land, very historic tract of land. If you can imagine the Robin Hood kind of scene, this sort of space where you would go if you were marginalized in some way. It's operated in this way for hundreds of years in England. It's a very special kind of place. So she pulls up there in the 50s with her husband in a caravan. They befriend Romanis who have a compound there. And so she has this life. We saw some photos of her there. This is Juanita. I'll let Kelly talk about those horse mothers. So this is her in the 50s with her husband Sven Berlin. I mentioned Ralph Vaughan Williams because he went there, the famous British composer, went to the New Forest to collect folk songs in the 50s, met Juanita. Juanita is fascinating. I've had to keep track of what her surname was in any given decade because she's in the archives. She's just under different surnames at different times. So she's Juanita Berlin for a while when these photos are taken. She appears in the on my back. She appears in the BBC archives in this period. She broadcasts a play called A Gypsy's Tribute to the Horse. She also appears in Ralph Vaughan Williams' archive because he interviews her at this point, collects folk songs from her. So she kind of, she's there's remnants of her as an artist, there are remnants of her as, somebody who begins writing plays in the 50s and so on. She also publishes an essay on the Romanis in the New Forest at this point as well. I might just finish up with the third marriage and then we'll turn to Kelly. Does that sound? So the third marriage. So she and Sven are doing fine. They move from the New Forest. They acquire a farm for a while on the edge of the New Forest where she attempts to, this is her yet another expertise, she attempts to crossbreed a zebra and a horse. It's called a zorse, right?
I think there are other names for it too, but that's one of them.
That's the one she used. And she failed, but she, it was a lifelong obsession with her to do this. There was a groom there on this farm called Fergus Casey. This is where the surname comes in. He was 11 years her junior. He was very like her. He was from a sort of a moneyed family in Ireland, but had sort of taken off to live an unconventional life. So they struck it off really, really well. She ran off with him to Ireland, and that's where this is the sort of the beginning of Juanita, the Irish writer. In many ways, she makes a life with Fergus in Ireland. She begins to publish when she moves to Ireland. All of her best writing is written in Ireland or about Ireland. So really, this is what I mean when I call her a British writer, or a British artist but an Irish writer. And Fergus was from a famous newspaper family in Ireland, and they attempted to start a newspaper as well. And I'll just finish by saying that in 1964, she and Fergus, for any of you who have had babies, think about this. She and Fergus are in a tent on Achill Island with the newborn Sheba. They spend 6 weeks in this tent in the summer on the Achill Island strand off the west coast of Ireland. It is during that time that she somehow produces the manuscript for The Horse of Selene under those incredible conditions. So I'll leave it at that. We'll stop for the moment, and we might turn to yeah.
Sure. Well, I'm not the only horse person in the room. I'm going to call out Sarah as well. So, and there may be others. I mean, I have more questions than I have answers, that's for sure. But most of what I would have to say comes from the novel itself, which is, it's so clear from the novel that not only does Casey know not just horses, but dogs and all animals and observe them with real care and attention and exactness, but she can describe them perfectly. And I'm always reading novels that have like a dog that appears, and it's clear that the author doesn't really look at dogs. They just wanted to put a dog in a scene.
Yeah.
I'm calling out Sally Rooney on this one. The dog in Conversations with Friends, and Sally Rooney doesn't know dogs, or at least doesn't observe them well. But she's perfect. I mean, pitch perfect, I think, with every horse description. So maybe if you're not as into horses, maybe you don't care as much. But to me, that's the real magic of, among other things, part of the magic of the book is just how perfectly visualized all of the animals are in it. It also, like the very little bit of her biography that I know, I'm struck by how unusual she is as a person, but also the things that she does that are already various and cool. She does like the weirdest version of them or the coolest version of them. So not only is she training horses, but she's trying to breed a zorse, you know? And like zebras are like notoriously untrainable, right? Like you can't break a zebra. I was reading up on this before today, and they try to they'll sooner die than let you ride them. So people have bred them and tried to train them. So it's like she was setting herself like the biggest challenge she possibly could, right? Breed a cross between a horse and a zebra so you can break this one thing that you can't break. And then the drawings and the photos, the photos in particular, if you go, from what I read, I can't remember if it's in your afterword or if it was somewhere else, but she bred Appaloosas in Ireland, which is so weird, right? Because the Appaloosa is this Native American breed of horse. It's particular to the American West and the Pacific Northwest even. You know, it's not a horse that you would find traditionally in Ireland, and they exist all over the world now, but for her to have been breeding them was this in the 60s, you said that she was?
In Ireland,
photos,
so I'm not, let's see. It looks 60s in terms of her age right there. But that may be earlier. That could be the farm on the edge of the New Forest, which would be the late 50s, I think, yeah.
Anyway, it is an Appaloosa, and she's riding in Western tack, and you know, it's somewhat. I mean, there is an interest in like cowboys in the Western in Irish culture in the 20th century, of course. But you know, it's striking visually to see her riding an Appaloosa, and then the paintings. I don't know if she's named after a tiger.
Oh gosh, yeah.
I forgot
that's
an
incredible detail.
Yes,
so her birth name is Joy, and then her uncle Walter had a lioness that had been left behind by the circus, and he named Juanita after the lioness.
Yeah. And this is probably completely unrelated, but the kind of Appaloosa that these are sort of, I would suggest based on, is a leopard Appaloosa. The spotting is called leopard spotting. So the central horse protagonist is, I think, a kind of version of a leopard Appaloosa that crossed with a
I like that
a
you said
traveler
protagonist,
horse.
because
Yeah,
the
it is a
animals,
horse protagonist.
I mean, it opens with animals. They're kind of, although this is a romance, the animals are
Yeah.
more central in some ways.
We don't even meet the human characters for several pages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Should we read?
Do you want to read the opening?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, I have the opening.
Yeah.
Okay. Is this the very beginning of the
This is
novel?
the very beginning,
okay.
yeah.
There had always been horses on the island, a wandering fluid band which had additions at times when a pony broke its hobbles and was away to them, and no one bothered to go and catch it when an ass is better, all told. Or the tinker's piebalds would join them, and these being usually entire, it was pretty sure the next year there'd be some magpie foals with the mares. Ponies, a couple of cart horses, and a few good lookers, all as unkempt and wild as mountain sheep, and all colors. Death took away from them too, but mostly the body lay where it fell, for it is a great big horse, and the dogs of the island would eat their owners should they fall down. Often the beast would lie strangely by the sea's edge, with the head stretched out on the tide as though it could see some great land afar off. Their leaders changed too, sometimes a gaunt old mare, sometimes a cocky stallion. A dun left behind still some of his wily breed, which are good for anything and indestructible in the heart. A black with a head like a curragh one year, and this time a white, a true white, with a pretty way of going and a tail he held up like a gale warning. They looked grand when lit by the sun, or drinking in the lake of an evening when the swans creamed down on the dark water to take their night's rest, but most thought the horses were a nuisance, a danger, and not what you wished your daughter to see when some damned stallion began his stuff right outside your windows. They trampled the gardens, broke down walls, splintered fences, ate washing, and terrorized strangers with teeth and bullying. The worst was the harm they did in the graveyard, to which they were drawn by its lush grass, and if not seen in time and driven out, they would doze propped against the headstones, or lie on a newly dug mound and roll in its flowers. The big black with the lightning blaze rocks gently back and forth with his behind digging into the pleasantly sharp edge of a Celtic cross, and the white, raising his tail, sighs, and Mary, beloved wife of Fintan Duffy, receives an unexpected tribute which would guarantee a powerful growth of grass around her for a good year.
Nice. So I might get back, but can we just move? You will just reinforce what Kelly was talking about there to the QE Queen Elizabeth II's horse.
Yeah.
So this is an extraordinary. I don't know if you want to say a sort of. I mean, I think this is amazing.
I would love to know more about the story, but it was a gift.
It was a
Queen
gift
Elizabeth
from and maybe this is part of the reason that the horse was sort of sent away as well. It was a gift from the Soviet government to Queen Elizabeth II. It was a stallion, and the story was she befilled me in it. It had travelled overland to Britain and was very distressed and high-strung to begin with, and it was very unmanageable. And Juanita had been corresponding with the Horse and Hound magazine about her, so she had some really cutting-edge way of sort of mastering unruly stallions that she wrote to this very famous English publication about. And the Queen's Equerry read it, got in touch with her, and said, I have a challenge for you. And sure enough, she as you can see, she got him under control, and this photograph taken in 1956 of her in a beautiful velvet riding habit was not made public until a few months ago, when it was launched. The novel was launched in Ireland in July 2022, and the Afghan ambassador to the US absolutely loved this. He retweeted it. He was like, "This is one of our horses," So it's a real thing in Afghanistan. They're very proud of this. What is it?
I don't remember the name of the breed. They're very rare.
They're very rare. They're very expensive.
Yeah, and they're bred from. Because of the history of Afghanistan, they're bred from various different horses and from Russia and and Turkey and like the Arabian is in there too. So yeah, they're an interesting breed. I don't know much about them. I told Mary I'm trying to channel 14-year-old me who knew every horse breed in the world, and that was a while ago. So but Again, I mean, is this in England that she's training the horse?
This is in
Or she's
England,
based
yeah.
in
This would
England?
be in the 50s. She's still, this is almost certainly the farm on the edge of New Forest when they leave the caravan New Forest and get hold of a farm for a while. It's almost certainly in that location
Yeah.
that she...
There is a Wikipedia page for the Queen's horses.
Aha!
You might not know this.
Good Lord.
Because
Okay.
I was like, I have to find out more about this horse, this particular horse of the Queen. He's not mentioned. So you might have to
Really?
add him in.
Right.
It's only her prized like racehorses.
Right. I do suspect that 56, a gift from the Soviet government, was a problem for the Queen. So that was some of why he was sent off to the New Forest, as well as the fact that he needed good handling. I think there's a whole geopolitical sort of aspect to this that we're missing. But should I sort of think about her in terms of the Irish canon for a minute?
Sure.
Yeah.
I was
How are
gonna
we
say,
doing for time?
We're doing well.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, Mary, how did you find Juanita?
So my first book was on Irish travellers, both as depicted by mainstream Irish writers. And I should explain, I'm not assuming everybody knows what Irish travellers are. So they're a historically nomadic, historically non-literate, not illiterate, it's a very different thing. A minority, they present as white Irish, but they're very racialized as a sort of a caste, a low caste minority. They're indigenous. So I was looking at the depiction of them in mainstream Irish culture, and they're both romanticized and demonized, needless to say. And then I finished the book with chapters on traveller memoirists who start to emerge in the 60s, and then traveller writers themselves, start to emerge. Juanita would have been one of the first. She very much identified, this was her lived experience, this was her understanding her whole life, was that she was an Irish traveller. She definitely was travelling stock with maybe in Romany, but she understood herself the Irish traveller. So that was very central to her sense of herself, to her sense of herself as an Irish writer, and to her sense of her vantage point, I think, within the Irish canon as well. She was standing on the edges to a certain extent. Think about it, this is a historically non-literate culture. This is a point of view that had never been represented, really, in Irish writing. And she's very self-conscious about representing this. So that's where I came across her. I contacted her. I can't even remember how, good old Google perhaps, but I tracked her down. She corresponded with me. This would have been 2007, 2008. She passes in 2012. And she wrote me these letters, as I said. So that was the start of it, And then it was your event where I spoke to Sarah from Tramp. And so it was like 10 years after I had corresponded with her.
Oh, really?
That I started talking to Sarah. And then I got in touch with Sheba, her daughter, who was raised in Kerry for the first few years of her life. And Sheba was a massive help, Yeah.
So much of these projects feel they're excavational, right? So much of it is about tracing a person's life, as you've done so well here, in order to kind of position this text in a new context, right? So kind of where do you see the current moment? How might this novel be taken in by a new readership?
So I think that it's incredibly ahead of its time in many, many ways. The tenor is very contemporary, first of all, in terms from a literature point of view. It reads like if you know your Kevin Barry or your Marina Carr, or even a certain Synge, Synge plays, that kind of interest in characters who are a little bit grotesque, that interest in exploring a kind of an underbelly, refusing to be sentimental about rural Ireland, refusing to idealise islanders and so on. I think the best way to think about Juanita in terms of where to position her in the contemporary moment is there is a lyricism and a poetry which I'd love to get to at the end. I'll do a tiny reading from it, but it has to do with the landscape most of the time, with nature, with animals, with and women are included in nature and animal in this novel. Women who are free, who are unfettered, are sort of on sort of one side of a binary, along with unfettered animals, wild animals, versus very domesticated men in many ways. And so you have this kind of this lyricism around landscape, around nature, around animals, but then so it's a Synge. If you've read Synge's Iron Islands, it's kind of a Synge landscape, but it's peopled by grotesque characters out of Kevin Barry, out of Martin McDonagh, if you've all seen the Banshees of Inisheer, that sense of, it's very diverse in that everybody's crazy in a slightly different way, on this island. So that, I think, obviously, that's where she fits in the canon. She sounds, the voice is very, very contemporary in its irreverence. Flann O'Brien was considered a peer, but also I think her concerns. There's a real sexual sort of freedom in this novel that was not the Ireland of 1971, so it was ahead of its time that way. It was also ahead of its time, I think, in terms of being pro-traveller. This was a rotten period to be a traveller in Ireland. Travellers were under actual physical attack with shotguns at night by people who did not want them moving into their area. It was maybe the lowest point of traveller-settled relations was the period in which she's writing. I think she's very much responding to the politics of the era, sort of positioning herself as sort of an under siege minority. But I think really where it seems very, very 21st century is its environmentalism. There's an absolute attention to nature in this. Might I read, there's a lovely, this is not in there, this is just a little lyric that she published a year after this novel. And I think it says more about her environmentalism than sort of I can do by sort of synopsizing the novel. But I have been exploring Juanita the writer, but in Ireland this November, when I was there for the Trinity Fellowship, I discovered Juanita the environmentalist. She made a massive splash in the 1970s in the newspaper because the departments of fisheries, wildlife and fisheries, I think they were called, they had proposed to cull a particular wild bird that was disturbing the salmon population in some way, and they were going to cull it, the bird. And this was going to pass until Juanita wrote this vituperative letter to the editor of, I think, the Irish Press, who was very amused by a woman using this kind of language, this strong, condemnatory language. And it became sort of front page controversy. And there was all kinds of responses. I guess I always thought that she was, Juanita the writer in 1970s Ireland, but she was very much the environmentalist as well. So this is her riff on Yeats from a year after the novel. And you'll recognise, of course, what she's riffing on. I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, where dying otters rot and gasping fish are laid. They've sprayed the 9-bean rose and killed off the honey bee, and nothing lives at all in the silent glade. Isn't that fabulous? So that, I think, it speaks to our moment as well, hugely,
The activism there is really strong, and thinking too about the kind of resistance to the romanticization, especially thinking Achill Island, the Paul Henry, like that seems to be the antithesis of everything that she wants to be taken away from what she's creating. And that feels really important too, in thinking about the kind of realities of Ireland instead of the romanticization of it.
The structure of the novel's unusual too. It's not a straightforward narrative. There is a narrative arc, but it's sort of, it's like 20 pages before you even know who the characters are, really. You see them for a minute or two, but you don't really know what anyone has to do with anyone else. And we're introduced to all of, little glimpses into households and people's lives who we never see again in some cases. And it's very funny. And mean. It's mean.
She's mean about humans, just humans.
Very mean about humans, but in a great way. And it's not sentimental at all, right? Very deeply unsentimental, particularly in describing people who we don't see again. But it's also, it's set on an imaginary cross between the Aran Islands and Achill.
It's Aran Killa, Aran and Achill, I imagine, right?
And but it's also an island mobbed by tourists. So it's kind of appropriate in that way. But they're also counterculture hippies who are sort of just, traveling around Europe for years at a time. So it feels very of its moment in a way too, but in a way that I don't think we often get in Irish literature of this period.
Of this period,
50s, 60s.
I think it's a very, it's a woman's version as well, because you have this reverence for the island from Synge, from Robert Flaherty, the Irish-American filmmaker who makes Man of Aaron, and it very much sees these kinds of visions from male creatives, sees Aaron as this rooted, authentic space. And in Juanita's take, the islanders are, they're just greedy. They've turned their paradise into a tourist trap, and they very consciously will destroy their environment if they can make a buck out of it. They're building houses everywhere to rent to tourists and so on. So it's this vision of Aaron that would still be rather cutting edge. Actually, we still like to imagine that Aaron or Achill are removed from that kind of nexus, that they're more authentic, they're more real. And Juanita was like, no, they're not, And so she very much has this binary of, as you said, the bohemians who come in, the traveling tinkers, as she calls them, the travelers who come over for the day, the wild horses. These are all kind of placed above the greedy islanders who are very much seen to be, despoiling their own paradise, right, in some ways in this novel,
And there's also the strangeness of getting the endings of people's lives kind of in the middle of the novel. There'll just be like a little section and it's like jumps 25 years into the future and tells us what happens to someone.
Yeah.
Just for a couple of paragraphs.
Yeah.
And then we're back in, whatever year it's set in.
Yeah.
Everything else is inconsequential. And
in some cases it kind of does, you're like, well, that character didn't make it.
Yeah.
Now I know.
Yeah.
And in other cases you're not sure.
Is it an awareness of the sort of the time scale of nature versus the time scale of the humans? Perhaps, that may be what's going on. Because there are references to, how long the stones had been there and so on, versus, as you said, the fleetingness. And it's very much, it's a summer novel too, isn't it? It's the sense of these young people who are looking for romance, who are finding romance. So it's Selene, the bohemian, part Greek, part sort of a gypsy in some way. She meets Miceal, the rooted local farmer who must choose between staying on the farm or taking off with Selene. So it's very much that summer romance plot, which makes it sound really conventional. Yeah. But it really upends that because Miceal is the virgin and Selene is the sexually experienced one. So it doesn't conform to the usual script of the romantic novel either. It does everything differently, I think.
Yeah. And there's some priests who make
the priests are great fun,
multiple appearances and rant and rave a lot.
Yeah. I think she does capture the tenor of 1970s Ireland with the priest who really tells people what to do, and Miceal in the end, I think Miceal refuses his instincts. He refuses nature. He refuses sexuality, and he's punished really for it. Nature punishes Miceal in the end, I think.
Can we talk? Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say it's reminding me of conversation a couple of weeks ago. We had Malcolm Sen here, and it's this kind of perpetual theme of the earth doesn't actually need saving. It's the people that do. The people
Earth will be fine.
Yeah, earth is fine. Earth is joyful. It's the people that need the work. But sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
Well, no, I was going to ask about the prose style. It's not really a question so much as it's a question, I suppose. She uses so many adjectives and so many metaphors, and the prose is so rich and just laden with imagery, and that sounds terrible. To me that sounds like, oh gosh, that's over the top, but she carries it off. She does it brilliantly. Where does she get that, do you think, and how does she who are her influences here? I
really think of her as an Irish writer. I think there's a tenor in there that's very Synge, that's very Flann O'Brien, and then in terms of people who even come after her, it's very Kevin Barry, Marina Carr. I think that there's that tension between a lyricism and then a kind of an embrace of a profanity and a reverence is very Irish. She does describe her writing process in 1972 in the Journal of Irish Literature, which dedicated a whole issue to her.
Wow.
And it's something like, when I write, it comes spilling out. It's and it comes out at the most inconvenient time, and I'm making soup, and I just have to drop everything and start scrawling, and it just comes out in a tumble. This is how she describes her writing process. Yeah. So she doesn't sort of sit down and mull over particular words. So there's a flow, there's rhythm to the language that's very instinctive, I think.
Yeah.
That's where it comes from. That's how she describes her process. It's an extraordinary description. When I'm in the middle of making soup, this happens to me. I have to leave the soup aside.
I was teaching earlier today, but I had this novel in my mind, and we were talking about a different novel, a very contemporary novel, and MFA programs came up, and the novel we were talking about was not an MFA program novel, but this is also not an MFA program novel,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not,
No.
it's a
postnatal novel.
it's like a self-trained novel,
Yeah.
though. It sort of does
Yeah.
its own thing. It doesn't follow
Yeah.
any rules, but in
No.
a great way.
It doesn't follow any of the rules.
I am conscious of time, and I know we have someone in the audience who knew Juanita
Would
quite
you
well.
mind if I had a 2-minute
Yeah,
reading?
no, go
because
for it.
I would really like to give because we've kind of and then we can finish up. Because I thought it was important to kind of just finish on this note of sort of the tension between the lyricism versus the earthy humor. This is very much the lyricism, and this is very much, I think, where you see her as an Irish writer. This could be a synopsis of a Marina Carr play. It could be a synopsis of a George Fitzmaurice play, if anyone knows him, a very late revival dramatist. And again, what you mentioned, just the sort of the strange structure. Yes, we have two central characters who fall in love. And we sort of go, they come into the narrative over and over. But we do have cameos, from a multitude, right, of islanders. And sometimes most of the time they're self-contained. A lot of the time, except for the postman, I think, we tend not to, or is it the guard? We tend not to meet them, And so this is one character called Longman Brannigan, whom we meet. But she does it so beautifully. This is 2 pages on him, but you get a complete picture of his life and his soul in that time. And this is where I think, I kept saying, she's very irreverent and she sort of has very flawed characters, but she can also be very tender. And there's a tremendous tenderness here. So he's this emotionally injured man who turns to the sea for solace. So the long man Brannigan, nearly 7 feet of him, walked back with his peculiar long stride from the harbour quay, his curragh humped and stranded like a small black whale. He was a great fisherman, on all waters, on the lakes and rivers, or at sea. He seemed to be always looking out, distantly, over water, unable to focus on the lesser things on the land. So tall, he looked at you with the pale, downward stare of a bittern. He walked with his body stiffly upright, his eyes unfocused, his legs wading him on with great pushing strides, as though he was taking on the Atlantic. He was deaf and dumb. No one knew his age, and very few remembered when he was neither deaf nor dumb at all, and ready to marry Bridie McDonough of a mainland village round the next bay. Bridie had other ideas, however, and hadn't considered telling them to an island man. She married Tommy Quinn, all teeth and money, with 2 handsome shops in the 2 biggest towns in the County Louth, and no knowledge at all of boats or of the sea. The long man had given them their wedding gift, though he said nothing to them, nor would he ever speak again. He stepped up to the bride at her reception in the Grand Mainland Hotel, and he gave her a small white box, such as shoes are packed in. Bridie opened it, a little uncomfortable with the long man standing there staring at her in his best black clothes, saying nothing. There inside lay a beautiful doll, dressed like herself in a white wedding gown. They could all see the long man was not in his right mind. Tommy Quinn insisted the doll be given back or thrown away. Even his suburban heart felt something was wrong, that ill luck was present. The long man took the box away with him all the way home to the island, to the back of his small white house, where he buried the doll in her white box and went out to sea. And that's Juanita Casey.
Yeah.
And thank you for having her in the room.
No,
And
thank you. Can we talk about what this is right here as well, just, and maybe we'll open up to our guests as well?
Sure. This is a 700 page, right? Juanita's autobiography. So, a woman who had 5 identities, 5 names, multiple lives, 3 children, 3 husbands, 2 nationalities, both settled and traveller, 700 pages. It could have gone much longer. I think it did. I've spoken to the publisher. I think she cut it down. But Allerton is here, who knew Juanita back in the day. It's wonderful to have him in the room. And I'd love to invite you to share your memories if you would. Sure.
Stand for a moment. And anyway, I welcome you all here. I love the Irish connection.
Yeah. Here, you can take my
We'll give
seat.
you a mic too.
Okay.
Well, I give him this one.
I think that
I'm just so grateful, really, to all of you for what you've done to make this inconceivable woman conceivable. Because really, there are so many stories that I could tell you right now that you would just shake your head and need another drink to hear them. I mean, and Juanita could look ahead in ways that were just astounding. Right, okay. When I first met Juanita, the reason that we were introduced is that I was a casualty from the rodeo circuit. And so we had both had experience, of course, with horses because she'd worked in the circus. And anyway, when I first met her and started talking to her, she said to me, "Did you ever have trouble with a certain color bull?" And I laughed and I said, "Yeah, every color." But when I thought about that, every time I had been hurt, it was a black bull. And anyway, I'm not going to go into all of the coincidences that happened in my life with the color black, but I mean, it was just an astounding look at the future. Juanita also, there was a man in Synge, because that's where I knew Juanita. And Synge used to win the Tidy Town contest in County Kerry every year. Anyway, there was the giant of Synge, and he was a big broth of a man, he was. And he was simple-minded. But the giant of Synge was also someone who terrified the villagers, because you never knew what he was going to do, and he was just so big. He was so tall, so broad. I mean, he was unstoppable. Anyway, he knew the valley the way no one else did. I mean, the farmers knew their own land, but the giant, he knew the whole thing. And anyway, let me just say one thing about the giant, that I became his friend, and he called me Yank. And I would always sit closer to the door than he was, in case things went wrong. He was very threatening, and he would say something to me, and then he would lean over me, and then he would say, "Huh? Huh?" Well, one day after a few huhs, suddenly he said to me, "They killed all my fairy stories. They brought me up like a giant. They never gave me a chance." And suddenly the giant was describing goats playing on a hillside in Tuscany. I mean, the giant was a poet in his own way, but anyway, there's much more on that. But he is the one who took Juanita and Sheba and me and an Irish boy and Juanita's two dogs and Bunge the cat in an exploration of Neolithic caves. And because they were part of ring forts, they were under a curse if you went into them. But we figured with Juanita, I mean, she was strong medicine. So it was the exploration. I mean, it was just to have gone through something like that with a woman like Juanita was just an experience I'll just certainly never forget. And anyway, I got a message from Sheba yesterday, and we still keep in touch with Sheba. And if I can get this back up on my phone here.
While Allerton is doing that, it occurs to me that the giant must have influenced the character of Longman Brannigan, who's
Yes.
7 foot tall. That's
right.
fascinating.
That's right,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
I mean, as you were reading that,
Yeah.
that was the giant.
Yeah,
And
I love this picture of her with the cat
yeah.
and The wolfhound. Right?
That's her wolfhound, yeah. Yeah.
And
And little
Sheba.
baby Sheba sticking out. There's a cat in between Sheba, or between Juanita and the wolfhound, if you can just make it out. So that's the whole family enjoying the lake. I think I think this was Sligo. Yeah, they'd gone to see Yeats Land, because again she knew her Irish literature and was fascinated by it. Have you-
Well, this is from Sheba. A child's memories filter the rainy days away for the most part, leaving rays of sunshine, bees buzzing, donkeys grazing, and cats and dogs dozing in the warm embrace of a summer day. Mum and me were always happy and together in our own company. We were so lucky to have shared all those years moving around as much as we did. Meant encountering up-teen characters and situations. A kaleidoscope of experiences enveloped us throughout our lives. I hope that Mum's writing will continue to echo and resonate in the minds of generations to come. The times are changing, and indeed, and life has metamorphosized so much since those sunbeam shafts of childhood recollection. Fragmented and scattered deep within the soul, always just there to ponder and savor in the decades that followed us, to ebb and flow in our conscience shoreline until the journey's end. And this is her last paragraph, and I just echo this too. A giant sized thanks to you, everyone who has been involved in the Horse of Selene, for what you are doing, and I wish you a wonderful day at the book launch.
Oh, thank you.
What a lovely way to then open up to maybe some questions from the audience. Yes,
Hi,
Tara.
Hi, Tara.
You mentioned, Mary, a bit about the issue that came out about her work. Could you talk a little bit more about the reception to the novel at the time?
Yeah. So it made quite a splash. It was reviewed in the New York Times, and it was called A Remarkable Novel by a Remarkable Woman. It was also reviewed in the Irish Times by no less a person than Roy Foster. I figure he was a grad student at the time, sort of writing reviews for Cat. And Roy Foster doesn't give praise lightly, And he said it was a lyrical novel, a beautiful novel, and so on. So again, it was also got high praise in The Guardian by the British poet P.J. Kavanagh, who's not Patrick Kavanagh, somebody else altogether. So all the major papers sort of reviewed it and liked it. And John Huston was interested in making a film at one point. Mm-hmm. I have the word unclassifiable up here, which was said about her, because I think that the fact that there was a double-edged sword to the fact that she was a traveller writer, perceived to be a traveller writer, because it got her noticed to begin with. But then when you see attempts to classify her amongst other Irish women writers, that word is used because they don't know how to fit her in. She doesn't fit in the box for nationality easily. She's not a settled writer fully. So, she's also ethnically distinct, And I think the important thing to think about with traveller and Romani identity is that it's transnational. Mm-hmm. So kin lines matter, just as much as a sort of national identity, which allowed an English-born writer to become an Irish writer in a way. But then the problem with that is that she didn't fit easy kind of categories and became unclassifiable. And my favourite sort of critical description of her by Robert Hogan was, he did a survey, he was writing in the 1980s, and he was surveying sort of Irish feminist writing. And he gives lots of synopses of various Irish feminists saying, most of these, he's describing all their works as kind of like, and here was my awakening, here was my coming to consciousness, and, I suddenly realized I was in the Matrix and I left my husband, And so there was narrative after narrative like this. And he just finishes and he says, and then, of course, there's Juanita Casey. And he was calling this whole movement, of course, women's lib, as you do in those days. And he said, now, Juanita Casey was never liberated because she was never caught. So even, you know, even she didn't quite fit the feminist kind of box either. The reception was great, but I think that in the long term, the very thing that got her noticed was the thing that meant that people didn't know what to do with her in terms of the critical longer life, you know.
Kevin.
Thank you so much for the presentation. And Jaunita Casey lived to be 87. She had a very vibrant and a lot of energy in her life. How did she deal when she was an elderly person?
Sorry, I missed the last part. How did she deal
How
when
did
she
she
was...
do in life when she became elderly? Because she was so on the go all the time.
Yeah. So I've talked to Sheba about this. She said that because she'd been riding horses her whole life, she had a lot of joint pain in the end, and she had rheumatism and so on, caused by her very, very active life. But she said her mind was as sharp as a tack until the day she died. She continued writing. She continued corresponding with, Horse and Hound and all of these sort of animal husbandry kind of publications, so on worldwide. She had contacts all over the world when it came to animals. So she said she did all of that. They lived in Devon. Afterwards, she and Sheba, they lived between a wooden chalet and a caravan. They had a whole menagerie of animals as usual, you know. And Sheba's wonderful because she'll look through random photos and she'll name each animal. They're like decades back, so they're like her siblings, you know. So they had a lovely life together. They were very tight, the pair of them, and they stayed together forever. She was, you know, she became a little physically feeble as she aged, as I said, but her mind was sharp as ever, apparently, you know.
I have a question from Kevin.
Thank you, Mary and Caroline and Kelly, for a great conversation. I have a question that came to me as I was listening to you. It's about it's a historian's question.
Okay, which I may not be able to handle. But yeah.
It may go beyond what we have, but I don't think it does. And obviously, it's a question about the origin of traveller communities, and it'd be great to hear more on that this evening. This question comes up when I'm teaching all the time, and
right.
I don't know the answer because I suspect in certain empirical ways the answer is unknowable. And in other words, were there traveller communities before the Cromwellian confiscations? Is it to do with displacement of the land? But what interests me more when I listen to you this evening is not that outsider's scholarly empirical question, but what do travelling people themselves say? Because when you use the word indigenous, it occurred to me the answer to the question, where do you come from, is, well, we didn't. Or we came from the land. And so when you read that passage of the devastation of nature, when you turned around the Innisfree, is there a story that's the obverse of that, that has to do with who we are, that it's not an origin story, and it's connected to the sense of land and environment. I just wondered if...
I guess my first book was kind of, my opening chapter had to deal with that very, very question. So the first, I guess the important, I stressed the phrase non-literate, as opposed to kind of an ignominious illiteracy, because to be non-literate is to not have a written record, which is the first stumbling block for us as a literate mainstream society. So there have, I suppose, if we're talking about cold hard knowledge, there have been genetic testing of travellers, and it looks like they were a splinter from. They became a separate community in Ireland about 500 years ago, approximately. That's what the latest. But travellers themselves are as any minority, who has genetics sort of used against them, they're not very comfortable with these kinds of. But I was even, for my book, I was even looking at, there was a medical doctor called Crawford, I think, in Ireland in the 70s and 80s, who used blood tests to actually ascertain something similar. He was able to sort of say something similar in terms of how long travellers have been separate. So they've been a separate population for approximately 500 years. They broke off from Irish society. They became, their culture evolved differently. And it evolved as a travelling culture with its own kind of norms and sort of customs and taboos and so on. So yeah, in terms of, I suppose, land ownership becomes central, doesn't it, to sort of Irish citizenship itself, with the Constitution, and land ownership is central to kind of Irish nationalist struggles and so on. It's always about land and then sort of getting control of the land, who controls the land. So it becomes a case of the land moving from the ownership of the old colonial elite to sort of, the new landowners in an independent Ireland. But who gets left out of that? It's a population like this who have no interest in ownership.
Then is there a narrative that resists the cold hard knowledge?
If a narrative that resists
the cold hard knowledge, in other words, is there a story told?
Oh yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful, there's a great writer called Owen de Vardoon, who's a folklorist and a herbalist from the traveller community, and he actually went around to the campsites and recorded the oldest men who still would be non-literate, who would have the oral lore, because just because they're non-literate doesn't mean they hadn't culture. They had oral culture, of course. They had folklore, they had folk tales, which all, of course, have a completely upend the usual hierarchy, in terms of their values. And so Owen de Vardoon would be more interested in recording what travellers themselves, how they see their origins, because of course they have their own origin stories. Of course they do, And so his book is called As the Moon Flies, some title. It's a beautiful looking volume. It was published about 2 years ago. So I'd recommend his work, to get a feel for the narrative that is generated within the community about its origins.
Is there resistance to these narratives leaving the community? We've been talking about where does Jaunita Casey kind of fit in the Irish canon, and I wonder, is there resistance to the kind of private community-based stories and origin stories that are folklore and that are oral, the questions of access for outsiders?
I think that somebody like Owen de Vardoon said an incredible thing when he was being interviewed. He was published in, I think, 2020. He said it was the first time that traveller oral lore had been collected by a traveller. Yeah. Which is extraordinary that it took till 2020. So yes, I think that he would see it as a very necessary thing, and so, for instance, that you've hit on the nub of it, because there is a traveller language called Cant or Gammon, depending on where you're from within the community, and it was collected by scholars. Leyland was one of them. He was of Irish descent in the University of Liverpool, which has a gypsy archive, so-called gypsy lore archive to this day, and Leyland collected a traveller Cant. Yeats was interested, and of course he's interested in everything, and there was a great resistance because there was a great resistance to publishing the vocabulary of the language, because it was in the past it would have been called a cryptolect, which now has negative connotations, but this sense of a language the community had to sort of talk about community issues, in a way that was, would close off people who were listening in, eavesdroppers and so on. And so there was a great resistance to sort of publishing these lists of vocabularies, because travellers believed that the Irish police studied these lists of vocabulary so that they could, when they sort of came into the camps, they could eavesdrop successfully and so on, so absolutely, I
think we might have time for a couple more.
One thing that I just want to add, and it's the way someone like Juanita could keep it together when she was going in so many different directions at once. And I think that having read a lot about Ulysses S. Grant, I think I see a bit of an answer. Equine therapy. I mean, when you were in rhythm with a horse, it is really restorative. And given all her time on horseback, I think that that helps to explain a lot of her success.
I think there's a question from Sarah.
Can't imagine Juanita ever been stressed about anything.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful evening, wonderful talk. I was also kind of, I think, going on in terms of horses, and had a question about horses, and particularly about this kind of idea that's come up, I think, several times tonight of wildness and liberty. And her history, particularly in the New Forest in the 1950s, which is when the wild New Forest pony population had gone down dramatically in the 1940s, and there were various kind of groups attempting to replenish it at that time. And I wondered more generally in terms of her environmental activism and kind of how this wildness kind of comes through as a theme in her writing, how much she was involved with wild horses and activism around that.
I don't know the biographical answer, but I think it's really interesting that in this book, well, the wild horses are kind of released, domesticated horses, right, that breed and create a kind of wild horse community, but they're sort of partially domesticated still. A lot of them have saddle marks and harness rubs and things on them, and people can kind of take them and still use them and ride them sometimes. Well, it's part of the plot of the story anyway. But the ending of I'm not going to give away the ending of the novel, but part of the plot of the novel revolves around like the islanders finding the horses to be a nuisance, so wanting to get rid of them or wanting to round them up and kind of, it reminded me of Chincoteague and Assateague and rounding up the wild ponies and swimming them across, and you auction off a certain number of them. It's sort of like the same idea in this novel. So so I can't talk more about the plot, but like something, it's maybe not a good thing, or maybe it is a good thing that they want to kind of remove them. But then there's also this idea that like the wild creatures get broken, right? They get used by
Well, just
Selene.
one though, right?
Well,
Yeah.
all
Is he a
of them.
stand-in for Miceal? Yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, she rides two of the horses.
That's right. She does. Yeah.
And then, one of the things that this character does is try to sort of tame the lead stallion that looks like the drawing, the paintings. So there's this sense that
tension,
the wild creatures they have to be, they're supposed to be wild, but under the control of one person anyway. And is she wild too, or So I think she's dealing with those questions in different ways.
Yeah, and I guess the ending makes us wonder: did Selene do the right thing?
Yeah,
Potentially. But we don't want to talk too much about the ending.
Go read the book, and we'll come back another day and talk about that.
And more to discuss downstairs with a glass of wine,
Yeah,
perhaps.
yes.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. Thank you, Kelly.
Caroline.
Thank you all
Thank you,
for being
Caroline.
here.
Thank you, Kelly.
And go buy a book.
Thank you, Alison.
Yes, and thank you, Alistair.